That brings me on to something I think is really important to talk about, ladies and gentlemen. Concept of justice, concept of, truth winning out, of good being done, an objective good, right? Which is pretty much the central linchpin of justice, right? We feel a sense of injustice when the truth has not been, or basically, I suppose the truth has not been legislated on, as if things haven't been resolved in a morally good manner, in accordance with an objective standard. Right, that would be the concept of justice. We have an injustice when, any number of the horrific crimes happen to young girls in this country, right, as a result of the rape act. And it was a severe injustice when, rather than those people either being sent to prison or executed, whatever it may be, right, that they were given super lenient punishments. In many instances, then the girls themselves were criminalized, families were criminalized, all because it would have been deemed racist or intolerant or all of these things. It's one of the biggest cries of injustice that's been seen this century, and even the last century as well, right? Because these things are still going on, and they've been going on for the better part of a century now, since, the midway through the 20th century up until present day, right? But these themes of, not having justice be done because of allegations of racism or allegations of intolerance, all of these things, right, no matter what they are seemingly baked into the justice system of our nations. And that's why we're going about the whole justice system being woke and all of these things, right? But they openly say it. Politicians say it openly if you know what to look for. But if you don't know what to look for, if you have been taken in by the propaganda, taken in by the wordplay and all of these things, because the left is the heart of these movements, right? And the people behind all of these movements, they have played an extremely good game with the game that they have been playing. Think about the names of the acts that have been introduced in Britain, right? The Equality Act. Are you going to be against equality? It's just a name that's been chosen to smuggle in all other kinds of meanings, all other kind of nonsense. In many instances, anti-British nonsense, right? And many instances, other kinds of racism, namely anti-white racism. But if you say that the Equality Act needs to be repealed, you're against equality, you're against all of these things. How evil and bigoted you are. It's just the names of these things have been chosen so, blatantly politicized, but they've been chosen with a specific reason, because instantly it puts people against these ideas on the back foot. It's like a rhetorical sucker punch. A lot of the names of these things are, you're squaring off with somebody, you're about to have this thing, but like they're extending the gloves, right? They're extending the gloves in the middle of the octagon, to give a high five or whatever, and then they pull their hand back and they launch a big overhand right over the top or whatever. When you see that in the UFC, if you're going to do that, a lot of people say, I don't like doing the whole hand touch thing or whatever, that's fair enough. But if someone's going to come out and do it, right, and instigate that gesture, and then when the opponent reciprocates, be like, oh, okay, we're going to have this, it's a sign of respect, saying like, okay, we're going to do what we're going to do now. We're going to abide by the rules and such. But then that person, after instigating it, pulls back and uses it to try and get some advantage. It's not necessarily against the rules, right? But it's unsporting. It's unsportsmanlike, right? And it shows a level of, I don't know whether you want to call it duplicitousness, I guess, lying, essentially. And again, it's not necessarily against the rules, but it's designed deliberately to put that person on the back foot, and it's unsporting. That's why they use Equality Act. That's why they use terms like anti-racism, which means, which in many instances now, it's just race Marxism, and it's against cultural whiteness, with race being one thing, but now it's the linchpin for restorative justice, whereby recently you've seen in Chicago, there was a black man with 72 prior arrests that just burnt a woman to death by setting her on fire on the subway. Right? He had 72 prior arrests. But if he was to be sent to prison, it would have been deemed as racist, because based on skin color, you can only have some people are inherent oppressed, some people are inherent oppressors. Right? It's the same system that led to the murder of Irina Zarutska. It's the same system that the activists are relying on to try and get Austin Metcalf's killer off the hook. Right? All of these different things, but the Welsh government showing that they want to cow down to these activists. They want to embrace this system, right? Which in many instances now is just anti-white racism. That's what it is. It's just anti-white racism. So Mark Drakeford was on the floor of the Senedd going on and bemoaning that on population scales, so many more black people are in prison versus white people, and implying, which if you have a look at the organization he references as who he has support for and who he's seemingly taken his guidance from, seemingly the Race Council of Cymru, which we'll go over those in a moment. They're blatant race Marxists and liars. We'll go over those in a moment. He calls the disparity shocking, which, yes, it is. Yes, it is. But not for the reasons that they want to, put forth, right? And he said it would be addressed by robust elements of the race equality plan. Now, I've got some things to go over with regards to this, ladies and gentlemen, but here is that clip of Mark Drakeford on the Senedd floor going on about this. But then we're going to go over some stats. We're going to go over some other things with regards to explaining how dangerous this actually is, and really how anti-Welsh it actually is.
Are imprisoned for every 100,000 people in the population, 91 black people are imprisoned. And that is a shocking analysis. It's why in the cooperation between our two parties, we have a specific commitment to ensure that the justice elements of the Race Equality Action Plan are robust and address these matters with the police and the courts. And that is the way in which we intend to take forward the practical ways in which we can address the figures that we've discussed this afternoon. The long-term.
Right, and then he goes on to say the long-term answer is to devolve policing and stuff like that, which I don't think many people would get behind at the moment. We've seen how inept our... Well, I don't know. Maybe leave it down below. Would you be in favour of devolving policing with the current Welsh government that we have and the next one that's likely to come in, which is likely to be some sort of Plaid Labour coalition with Plaid at the head of it this time, instead of being, the ones working with Labour in the background, right? I'm not exactly very hot on it. But then again, policing as a whole seems to be, an absolute shambles at this moment in time, with the same ideological rot that's perforated through all of our public institutions. So the race equality plan, so it's been signed off with and taken heavy, input from charities, quote unquote charities, like the Race Council Cymru, which, if you have a look on their website, is full of all of the standard lefty stuff on race, right? Working together to promote race equality, integration and justice in Wales is what they say, right? Race Council Cymru facilitates and manages events, projects and activities to support its strategic mission. So that's a big admission right there. But again, they try to cover up what they're actually doing with all of this colourful language, which we'll go over in a moment. Charity works with diverse ethnic minority groups and individuals across Wales to deliver the projects listed below. So it uses youth projects, it uses cultural and digital hubs, all of this stuff. They're all multicultural, which I'm completely against anyway. I'm a monoculturalist, if you will. So far, RCC's work encompasses many successes, including Black History Month, Windrush, Crossing Borders, and much more. So they have all of this stuff dedicated to the Windrush generation, right? Talking about different stories and all of these other things. One guy, which they said on there, which is quite interesting, he had a couple of different flags behind him, which I'm not exactly sure. One of them seems to be the Ghanaian flag. And literally the quote they use here, everyone is saying England is paved with gold and all that sort of nonsense, right? So it just seems that they've chosen some people who don't exactly have, the greatest outlook on the nations of Great Britain, right? Many instances now, people are outright using that leverage, that emotional leverage, right? The victimhood leverage against a disarmed population, both physically and intellectually, right? To see through this stuff. But they make it clear. They make it clear with the kind of stuff that they put out, right? So they're saying 5 years on, honouring George Floyd and the movement for racial justice. And this is where, again, racial justice. Just replace racial with any other kind of justice that you've seen communists use throughout history, like the Cambodian Khmer Rouge being focused on social justice and all of these things. And you see instantly, via this intersectionality framework, which they use to link all of these together, that it's just Marxism at its core. It's Marxism at its core. It's like the hat which they put the idea into, and out comes this thing. So they put racism into the Marxism hat, you end up with racial justice. They put classism into it, and they end up with the inherent class struggle of communism, right? Any other social factor, that's where the trans stuff can come in. That's where feminism comes in. It's where all of these other things are designed to divide people along all of these lines, right? And be able to pit all of the different people in a society against each other, so they forget who's actually pulling the strings, namely the government, and namely then who they are beholden to. 5 years on, honouring George Floyd and the movement for racial justice. Now, I was sadly taken in by this back in 2020, right, via social pressure. I remember feeling the social pressure at that time and seeing no end of people going out to buy books about like Robin DiAngelo and all of this stuff, the grifters, etc. I was taken in by it. I wasn't one of these people that were, flagellating to a massive extent, but I didn't have the tools to see through it. And obviously then you had the censorship apparatus. You had all of the things. This is where Antifa then came out of Black Lives Matter and all of these other movements that were running riot quite literally, and the propaganda machine was in full swing. You didn't see any of the other footage, which we're going to be going through in a moment, and we were sold this lie. We were sold this absolute lie, and groups like this want to keep it going. Groups like this want to keep it going. And then they say it with the initiatives they want to put through. So it says, we at Race Council Cymru join communities across the world in marking 5 years since the murder of George Floyd. There's the first lie. At least in my opinion, anyway. He wasn't murdered. He wasn't murdered. At least not by Derek Chauvin, which is obviously what they want to insinuate. His death on 25th of May 2020, beneath the knee of a police officer, was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. It was a tragedy. It was a tragedy. Absolutely. It was a tragedy, all of the different situations that he got into. It was a tragedy, all of the things he put all of his other victims through. Right? It's a tragedy what Derek Chauvin has been put through. The fact that he didn't get anything resembling a fair trial. The fact that he knew when going into that trial that it was already a done deal because there was a bunch of purple-haired rioters outside that were going to burn the courthouse and everything down if they didn't get the result that they wanted. Right? It sparked a global cry for justice that rang out in every corner of the world. From Minneapolis to Merthyr, people took to streets, screens to classrooms, and to their hearts to say, enough is enough. Yeah, the lie that made its way round the world very much so quicker than the truth could finish up lacing up its boots. But so many lies that we were told. But they wanna keep this going. They want to keep this going, right? So we're going to be going over all of the George Floyd stuff in a moment, ladies and gentlemen, going over some of the things that were available at the time, but due to censorship, due to demonetization, due to deplatforming, all of these things, we weren't allowed to see it. Many things that, myself included, were duped into thinking at the time, right? But thinking about the things that they want to do, the anti-racist action plan, one of the things which they, and I'll link this down below as well, where you can go see it. It's on the Welsh government's website, right? I'll link the link. I won't link the actual document, but I'll link the part of the website where you can go and download the document, because I don't think it really works that well. If I try to put the actual document in the links, it probably won't work, right? But it'll take you to the web page where you can find it. And they say governance structure of the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan, which started to be introduced in 2020, is 4 key components: external accountability group, internal support and challenge group, policy-specific EAG, so that's external accountability group subgroups. So hang on, we need the external accountability group, and then we need groups within that group. Kind of weird. And then engagement with ethnic minority people to capture their lived experiences via regional forums. Everything obviously being lived experience. But the biggest thing is why he's saying that this is institutionally racist in and of itself, ladies and gentlemen. They claim to want to address, as they say, systemic discrimination, right? Saying we want to promote equality and challenge systemic discrimination. They openly do it by saying that they're not going to listen to certain sects of people if they want to get in the government's way based on their race. Based on their race. We covered that last time. I'll play the clip again for you in a moment of Helith Fiken saying that exact thing. But they openly lie and say that a culture of anti-racism benefits everyone. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't, because you have some people who are inherently oppressed and you have some people who are inherent oppressors by virtue of their skin color, right? And as a result, you treat people differently based on that, right? This is why it's not anti-racism, ladies and gentlemen. It's reverse racism. That's the thing. That's the thing. And they openly say, our politicians openly say, as I'll play the clip for you now, we are not going to listen to the voice we're not always going to be listening to the voice of the majority if they're all white voices. Let me play this for you. This is literally Plaid Cymru representative in this instance saying that in order to implement and achieve an anti-racist Wales, you have to ignore certain people who are in the majority based on their skin colour.
We're not always going to be listening to the voice of the majority if they are all white voices. If we are serious about being an anti-racist Wales, and we seriously want to see that happen, there will be disagreement, and we're not always going to be listening to the voice of the majority if they are all white voices. And certainly in terms of seeing responses such as this, I think one of the very important things in terms of the consultation is that we see who responds.
See, they literally say it.
If there is opposition, from what viewpoint is that opposition coming? And it was just a painting on the wall for me, but when Black Lives Matter emerged as a campaign, I then came to understand, because of my privilege as a white person, that I wasn't aware of the history, the problematic history of that portrait.
Yeah, a problematic history of being a white person. Well, the problematic history of being the first civilization on moral grounds of a certain religion, which is now being deemed as oppressive in and of itself, to abolish the institution of racial slavery. You go to many of these other many other countries, the Middle East, right? Africa, where they're literally still enslaving themselves to this day, where this stuff is still going on as if it's freaking as normal as anything else, right? It's something as normal as us going to the Tesco and buying a frigging little bit of meat or whatever, which is increasingly getting more and more common because they're trying to drive up the prices to make it, less feasible for people to be able to buy them, and doing so deliberately, not to mention all of the other things, right? Because they want us to eat the bugs and own nothing, and we will be happy, yeah? And you have the... Slavery is as normal in many areas of the world as that is for us, right? It's unique with us. It's unique with white Western Europeans in particular. And we said, this is actually wrong. This is actually wrong in an objective sense, and we are going to get rid of it. We're actually going to get rid of it. That's a problematic history. Is it, Heleth? That's a problematic history. And if we're going to be playing the whole historical grievances game, where we have a lot more historical grievances with our young girls at the hands of many people who are in this country that shouldn't be in this country, not just Wales now, but UK as a whole, who shouldn't have been here, that never ever shouldn't have been allowed to be here. And we're going to play the historical injustice game, are we? But we only have to go back to, the 50s or even just slightly later than that, right? The grievances against the British people, right, for racial and religious reasons, a lot more fresh in the memory. Still going on today, actually. And you guys don't want to do anything about it. No, you're too busy addressing the opposite and fueling more of this stuff because you plan to ignore white people. You plan to be racist against white people. And that's showing that you are going to be going against the wishes of Welsh people. Because Welsh people, their ancestry, are white people. Welsh people, in terms of who someone is at who they are down to their very constituent parts, right? Not everybody can be Welsh for the same reason, and that's English and that's Scottish and all of these other places, right? For the same reason that not everybody can be Algerian, that not everybody can be Pakistani, that not everybody can be Russian, that not everybody can be whatever country you want to put it from, African and all the other places, right? Dutch. Just rattle off all the things. Rattle off all the different countries you want. The great lie is that anybody can be anything. And obviously then that's a lie that pervades down to the fact that men can be women, women can be men, all of this stuff, right? People are what they are. The government's showing here that they have plans to ignore their people. They have plans to ignore their people, even if they're in the majority, as the UK has been doing for generations now, which we'll go over when we look at polling data with regards to Windrush in particular. The government is now an authority accountable to no one other than itself. And that's how they see it anyway. And that's why they bend over backwards to do things for everybody except their own people. Because they hate their own people. If you're a Welsh person, if you're an English person, if you're a Scottish person, if you're an Irish person, they hate you. They hate you, and in many instances they want you dead. Or they want you whipped into subservience and they want your replacement normalized and cheered on by you. They want your genocide by replacement to be cheered on by you. They want the lie to be so entrenched in your brain that it becomes the truth. And that's why all of these propaganda psyop campaigns across generations, it makes your head hurt. Think about all of the propaganda that we've been pumped with, right? Not just on the whole anti-racist stuff, but you know, the trans stuff, the net zero stuff, all of this other stuff, right? All these other propaganda campaigns are nothing but to beat you into psychological submission. We have to just keep willing to see through it, ladies and gentlemen. Think about it. This organization, as I said before, contributions. Black History Wales 365. I don't think it's controversial to say that Wales doesn't really have any black history. I don't think that's controversial to say. As I mentioned, on the scale of the UK as a whole, you only need to go back to the 50s, right? Just before the Windrush generation and stuff like that started coming in, to see that Britain was essentially a complete ethno-state. Britain as a whole, right? And Wales, if you look at the ONS maps, is still, for the most part, very ethnically homogenous when you go outside of the cities, right? When you go outside of Cardiff or Swansea or Newport, you see very ethnically homogenous areas for the most part. And I don't actually know how accurate that ONS data is. I know you guys are like me, you're very skeptical. I think we have very, very good reason to be. But this is a negation of Welsh history. But they want to celebrate it year round. If you want to celebrate your history, maybe you get one day to do it, right? St. David's Day or something like that. But no, we get, if you want to fly a Welsh flag, much as they demonize the St. George's flag in England, right, as oppressive or divisive or whatever, right? That's seen as a, you know, discriminatory or evil because you get to celebrate your heritage all year round. Now, they're saying they want to do that at the same. But really, if you think about it, you go back 100 years, or not even that, there'd be no history of this kind to celebrate. And that's just the reality. Not because I don't necessarily not because I hate anybody or anything like that. It's because it's not. It's just not the history of these isles. It just isn't. Then you go back, 1,000, 2,000, right? 3,000, 4,000 years when we were, pagan cultures, Celts basically, when we were living as the Celts did, right? Where's the black history? The BBC will want to convince you that there is by supplanting people into their new series and stuff like that, but it never was the case. And the propaganda campaign will try and convince you that it was, but it never was the case. Never ever was the case. They also want to put through segregated, history of youth awards. So they got Black History Youth Awards, Black Lives Matter Policy Forum, which is literally, in my opinion, a terrorist organization, Zero Racism Wales campaign, unless it's obviously racism against white people to be able to further their political agendas. All the while doing so, whilst lying and lying and lying and lying, such as saying that George Floyd was murdered. Which obviously then we know that he wasn't. He died of a drug overdose, probably a mix of stress and COVID and all other things, right? His heart was, what was it like? He had cardiomegaly 150 times or something like that. I think his heart was about 150% the size that it should have been, right? First off, we can go through the empirical stuff, ladies and gentlemen. We can go through the empirical stuff. So you'll remember, now, if I quickly bring this up on screen... bear with me 2 seconds, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to bring something up on screen for you. You'll remember this if you were paying attention at any point, which obviously I didn't necessarily see this at first either, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm not being, snide or anything like that when I say this. This is, campaigns that we were taken in by, if you were like me, right? I'm just trying to reposition this so that it comes up on screen a little bit easier to see. Right, I've got it in position for you. Take a look at this. You will have seen this before. This is actually George Floyd's medical report. Now, I'll just zoom out a little bit just to make it... There we are. So you can now see it on full screen. You can now see that it's his name at the top. And this was something that was heavily, censored at the time, no other word to describe it. And you'll see there, section 3 of the report says no life-threatening injuries identified, no facial, oral, mucosal, or, conjunctival? Is that how you say it? Conjunctival petechiae? I'm not sure what these terms actually mean. Obviously, I'm not a medical scientist, right? No scalp, soft tissue, or brain injuries or anything like that. No injuries to the front of his body from this supposedly horrendous knee on the back of the neck that was supposedly enough to kill him. However, he did have fentanyl in his system to the dose of 11 nanograms a milliliter and 5.6 nanograms per milliliter of norfentanyl. Now, the relationship between those two, as far as I'm aware, essentially gives you an idea of how recently the dose was ingested, right? Because norfentanyl, from what I understand, and I'll bring another document up on screen now to sort of give a little bit more information about this. Norfentanyl is the inactive metabolite of fentanyl. So this is a document from Gary L. Collins to a Mr. Argoe, in reference to a Lyman Moses homicide in the state of Delaware. This is from June of 2021. And this is where I'm going to find out like roughly how much fentanyl will be enough to kill somebody, right, is what I'm looking for. A fentanyl blood level of what will be considered toxic enough to kill somebody, right? So this is... If I bring this up on screen for you now in a moment as well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just repositioning it so it looks, so it's easier to read. So what he says is norfentanyl is an inactive metabolite. This means that norfentanyl does not have, if I just reposition this, un momento, does not have any pharmacological effects on the body, not have any pharmacological effects. Since the concentration of norfentanyl is much lower, so the document's on screen now, concentration of norfentanyl is much lower than the fentanyl, it suggests that the parent drug was recently absorbed or consumed, and that the norfentanyl detected is likely a byproduct of the metabolism of fentanyl. And this is his expression. So his responses to the reasonable degree of medical and scientific certainty, and is his opinion, right? Question 4 is the key one, which I wanted to draw your attention to, though, ladies and gentlemen. This document will be linked down below as well. I'll hopefully be able to show. If not, I'll link the link down below to where you can go and download it or whatever, or view it. Understanding that every person is different, do you have an opinion as to a level that you have seen which would normally cause a person to overdose? If so, what is that opinion? In the vast majority of cases, so this is his answer, fentanyl concentration over 3 nanograms per milliliter in an individual with no other anatomic, natural disease or infectious etiology to cause death will be attributed to the fentanyl and other drugs detected. A lower level of fentanyl may cause death if other drugs cause respiratory suppression or sedation is present, such as alcohol, other opiates such as heroin, morphine, oxycodone, or benzodiazepines such as Xanax or Valium. Now, why is this important, ladies and gentlemen? You saw that George Floyd's level was 11, but he also had other comorbidities, which I believe weren't also talked about too much at the time, namely COVID, right? And I believe he had some other respiratory conditions as well, not to mention one of the things that happens with fentanyl is respiratory suppression, which is why he was saying before he was put on the ground, he could not breathe. Right? That's why he was saying before he was put on the ground, he could not breathe, right? This is Stephen Crowder highlighting this with the footage that he showed on his show, which if only many people like myself would have been able or would have seen this at the time, would have known about this at the time, we would have been a lot more intellectually armed to be able to deal with the massive propaganda campaign that came afterwards. This is part of the video on Stephen Crowder's show showing not only George Floyd's fluctuations between compliance and non-compliance, right? Not to mention the allegations that he was claustrophobic, even though he was literally just taken out of a car which was much smaller than the police cruiser, right? Also the fact that he'd spat out something in the back of the police cruiser, which was likely fentanyl in and of itself, from what I've heard. He was saying he couldn't breathe long before he was put on the ground, right? He was saying, oh, there we
Watching
go.
it again, more of the we'll roll down the window and more accommodation.
Look at it. We can picture it, but now while you're standing out. Okay, man. God, y'all do me bad, man. Man, I don't want to try to win. I I don't want to win.
I don't want to die to
I don't
win.
want to win. I'm claustrophobic. I'm claustrophobic. I got anxiety. I don't want to do nothing to them.
I'll roll the window down. What, a third or fourth time?
When I start breathing, it's going to go up on me, man. Hold your legs down. Okay. Let me count to 3. Let me count to 3 and I'm going in. Please.
They let him count to 3 like it's going.
So I'm going to pause that a minute. Yeah, I hit transition a little bit early. Sorry, guys. I hit transition a little bit early on this one. But you're seeing here he's going from compliance to non-compliance. They're being very lenient with him, right? One of the biggest lies that we were told at that time is that they were just inherent racial police brutality. They're cooperating with him a lot. There's a reason, obviously, why the prosecution and others didn't want you to see this body cam footage at the time where this was all in its prominence, right? When this was all hitting up and this was fresh in the memory, right? They didn't want you to see this because they wanted a predetermined verdict. They wanted Derek Chauvin to do the fall for something which I am strongly the belief that he did not do.
Going in the first pool dip of the season when it's cold.
Oh, boy.
And here you go is where they finally say, okay, enough is enough, and they need to get him into the car. And by the way, he just said, put me on the ground.
I'm claustrophobic. I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me. Get out of claustrophobic, man. In the car. Over here. I'm going to pull you out. Get in the car. In the front. Please. No, you're not getting in the front. I'm claustrophobic. I'll be in the car. Okay, man, okay. I'm not a bad guy, man. In the car. I'm not a bad guy.
They're not even touching.
Please, please, make a seat. Please, man. Please. No, to take a seat. I can't choke. I can't breathe.
I can't choke. I can't breathe. Okay. And then they end up finally pulling him out of the car. So we've seen enough. That's enough for the clip.
So he's saying there, and he's obviously a high-stress situation. Don't know exactly how verbal eloquent he was at the time anyway, but saying, I can't choke, I can't breathe. He's saying there, I can't breathe. And obviously he's working himself into a frenzy as well. Knows obviously the concoction of drugs that were in his system, in particular fentanyl, right? Knowing that he'd been caught doing something that he wasn't supposed to do. Knowing he obviously has a long history of crime, right? He was a career criminal whom the left have tried to obviously now venerate as a saint, basically. And obviously he knew what fate was going to await him. He knew that he was going to lose his freedom, and that's why he's trying to do everything possible to seemingly worm his way out of this situation. I don't like necessarily revisiting this 5 years later, but this is one of the biggest lies that we ever got told, and I still know people that believe this. I still know people that believe this, that he was murdered, and the only times that he was saying that he couldn't breathe was when Officer Chauvin had him on the ground and with his knee on his neck, and that's just outright not true. But we weren't shown any of this camera footage at the time. But people like the Race Council of Wales, people like Race Council Cymru want to still peddle these lies. And in fact, one of the things I think would be quite interesting for you to watch, ladies and gentlemen, I'll link it down below, is that you can say this is distasteful, you can say this is not exactly scientific, right, obviously, but Stephen Crowder went and actually recreated the experiment of being stuck under an officer's knee like this for the period of time that George Floyd was, right, to see if it would actually result in fatal, complications, should we say. As you can imagine, obviously it did not. And the other thing is, a lot of testimony from the officers, which they were basically coerced into giving, would have exonerated Chauvin because they knew that this was a technique that they'd been shown how to use and that they were cleared to use it, right? There were so many lies saying this is not an authorized police technique when it absolutely was, right? You can have the discussion on whether it should be an authorized police technique or not, but at the time, as far as I know anyway, this was a perfectly legal police technique to use that they were taught. And then obviously to go along with the lie, to appease the activists, to try and prevent this bigger situation for what we in the UK might call to appease community tensions, right? They went along with this lie and saying that, no, it's not a technique we're supposed to use, it's not anything that we're taught. Complete lies. But a funny instance, we won't play the entire clip, but here's Stephen Crowder actually being the recipient of this technique. I don't know if these people are actually police officers, right? Maybe he says it earlier on in the video and I haven't seen it, right? I don't know whether these people are actually police officers, but again, it's showing the absurdity of what's going on. But there are people, activists, who have the ear of our government that want to run with this. That's why we absolutely should be caring, should be mocking, and should be scorning it.
One.
Okay, all right. So
Timer down.
Neil
Neil
on my neck here, shoulder.
Yep. Pause the timer.
Oh my goodness.
It's okay.
There we go. All right, now I'll roll it back.
It's actually more uncomfortable for me because I have a bad shoulder. So my left shoulder right now has popped out of the socket, but
It's
that has nothing
5
to do with-
seconds in and you don't like it.
Oh no, of
Yeah,
course I
no,
don't.
of course.
Already complaining.
Hey, you know what, Dave? Sometimes you deserve to be arrested.
That's true.
He's specifically meaning you, Dave.
No, my response is agreement.
I think they were lower on the legs there, Brendan.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think they were more like on the hamstring area.
Okay.
All right.
There you go.
Right, I'll fast forward it a bit for you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll fast forward it a bit. Long story short, obviously here, this is the last 10 seconds. Obviously, long story short, which obviously you'll know if you do tune into Stephen Crowder similarly regularly like I do, I find him quite entertaining, and I find him a pretty good source of information as well. He was one of the first ones that leaked he was the first one that leaked the tip that he got from the ATF guys, detailing that there were the trans and anti-fascist ideology written on the bullets that were used in the Charlie Kirk assassination. Right, he leaked those. He was completely right, and they were sent to him by his source because they were concerned that the information was going to be buried. And you saw that with how many people came out afterwards saying that they were lies. They done the same thing with earlier shootings, like the I think it was there was the Tennessee one that he broke, that it was a trans shooter, right? I can't remember exactly which one it was. Was it Covenant? I think it was Covenant School. The Covenant School shooting, I think it was, that he also leaked information from that and was again completely vindicated. I think he's a pretty good source. I think he's one of the ones that takes what he does very seriously, even though he's predominantly a comedy chat. He's predominantly a comedy outlet, right? I not only find that the comedy itself in many instances is quite funny, right? But and again, a mark of the fact that in many areas you have the freedom to do the kind of skits that they do, whereas in the UK you probably get thrown in prison, right? But oftentimes a lot of what he says happens then to be correct and true. So I think he's pretty good. I think he's a pretty good source in that regard. And then this is the last 10 seconds of that. Well, needless to say, he obviously doesn't die. Yeah, here's the sort of conclusive proof that it wasn't the knee on the neck that killed George Floyd.
You know,
Time
It's
for
true.
10
You,
seconds.
Dave, you in their third
9,
chair, nice
8,
and comfy.
7,
It's very
After
nice.
having just relieved yourself.
5,
Oh, 5.
4,
We're almost there.
3,
4, 2,
1.
1. And now we beat it by 2 seconds.
Happy New Year.
All right, Tokenawan,
There
get
you
off.
go.
Get off. Okay, good. There
Right
we
now,
go. We're
get him
done.
up.
All right.
Get him up. Help
There
him
we
up.
go.
So there we are, ladies and gentlemen. There's your conclusive proof. There's your conclusive proof, again, being slightly satirical when I say this, that it wasn't the knee on the neck that killed George Floyd, but obviously these activists want you to believe that because they need you to go along with their plans, which if you're a Welsh person or if you're pro-Wales and the pro-Welsh people, to go along with your own destruction, basically. And that's what they want. That's what they want. They hate you. Make no mistake about it, they hate you. And a lot of the stories they draw on as well, I've no doubt that the people that they list on the website, the whole Windrush stuff, they're lovely people for the most part, right? But it does harken back to greater things that we need to talk about with the opinions, with the opinion polling that was done at the time, right? How it changed very, very quickly, right? And how it's been so long, it's been so many generations that the will and wants of the British people have been absolutely toppled and stamped on, right? So you had, for example, during when people were first starting to come in, and this is stuff which I'll just pull up on screen for you because a lot of the places where you try to go and get these are like password or not password, subscription based. And, I just don't have the funds to be able to do that at the moment. But you have, for example, one thing that I asked Grok, for example, were around the time when the Windrush generation was coming in, so through like 1948 to 1960, what was attitudes like, or what were attitudes like towards non-European or non-white immigration during this era? And it was very stark how quickly it changed. So there was Gallup polls done starting in 1954, for example, focusing on something which they referred to at the time as coloured or Commonwealth immigration, often a proxy for non-white migrants from places like the Caribbean, India, or Africa, right? Earlier insights are more qualitative, drawn from mass observation surveys and directives, a social research project that collected public writings, diaries, and observations on everyday life, including race relations. The sources reveal a shift from relatively tolerant or conditional acceptance in the early to mid-1950s to widespread hostility by the late 1950s, driven by economic pressures, housing shortages, and events like 1958 riots. Attitudes were marked by underlying racial prejudice, ambivalence, and fears of social change. Fears of social change, maybe their fears were at least somewhat founded. You only have to look at England to see that. With non-white immigrants often viewed as economic competitors or cultural threats. Oh, it does seem many instances of that having come true, where you go and see now that many non-white, particularly from areas like Asia, like Bangladesh and Pakistan and areas like that, they've openly made English towns and cities into their enclaves, right? And many of their representatives, such as the Tower Hamlets representatives you talked about before, will openly campaign as Bangladeshi nationalists for the Bangladeshi Nationalist Party in Bangladesh. But if a British person campaigns being a British nationalist, they're an evil oppressor. In Britain, a British person campaigns as a British nationalist in Britain, they're an evil oppressor, but it's perfectly okay for Bangladeshi nationalists to campaign as Bangladeshi nationalists in Bangladesh whilst then also being representative of Tower Hamlets. You don't think there's any conflict of interest there? Sage, I'm not even going at you because I know I'm preaching to the choir. I know I'm preaching to the converted, so to speak, for the most part. So what was the data like in 1954? So according to Grok, the data in this poll asked about integrated workplaces, racial hierarchies, and indicating early strains in race relations. Majority rejected, I'll bring this up on screen just so you can read it as well. A majority rejected wholesale overt racism, such as notions of white superiority or formal color bars, specific percentages not detailed in sources but described as wholesale rejection. However, the mere inclusion of such questions highlighted tensions. Direct quote, the fact that Gallup saw fit to ask question about integrated workplaces indicated that race relations were already strained, yet the wholesale rejection of white superiority of a color bar was somewhat more reassuring. If you can find these, ladies and gentlemen, and you can put more information about this in the comments, please do, because as I said, a lot of these I can't get into without, signing up to subscription or whatever it is, which I simply can't do at the moment. 72% of respondents favored immigration in 1956, so long as work was available. In many instances now, we're now seeing that work is not so available anymore, with 37% supporting free entry and only 18% calling for controls at that time, suggesting a pragmatic, job-focused acceptance of non-white migrants at this time, with limited outright opposition. I think a lot of people now, again, like the people who were on the beaches of Normandy, like our soldiers were on the beaches of Normandy, looking up in the sky and seeing what their country would turn into, maybe those attitudes would be a lot different. But a lot of people at this time, I think, were obviously quite ignorant of how these things would turn out, right? They were obviously very, very ignorant of how these things would turn out. They didn't have to deal with the long-term downstream consequences of these things, right? 1958. Only really when you start getting people in vast bigger numbers that you see, then they start supplanting our culture and our people with their own and with their culture, right? After Notting Hill and Nottingham riots, 79.1% supported immigration controls, rising to 81.5% in the London area. Additionally, they said that they would probably move, 61% said that they would probably move if large numbers of black people settled in their neighborhood. Only 9% solely blamed non-whites for the riots. 16% wanted restrictions targeted at non-whites alone, indicating that while attitudes hardened, they were not uniformly racist. Some respondents showed nuance. What they're showing there, ladies and gentlemen, is something that is intrinsic to human nature. Intrinsic to human nature, which is in-group preference and the natural consequences of that in the aftermath of a conflict that had occurred between two different groups. Like when your friend stands up at a bar, you stand up with him, right? That's basically what happened, except you supplant things, but you bring in other factors like race, and you bring in the fact that it wasn't just standing up at a bar, it was a full-blown riot. You see, there's British people. See, this wasn't happening before. When it was their own British people, we've brought people in, and now we've had this big conflict occur, right? We're going to side with our own people. And the only thing is, it's only British people that would be demonized for doing that. Or it's only Western white people that would be demonized for doing that. Anywhere else in the world, you wouldn't be demonized for doing that. Any other group in the world, they wouldn't be demonized for doing that in their own home. In their own home. That's the thing to remember. This is the home of the British people. And like you reserve the right, when you have a guest or a visitor in your home, to tell them to leave at any point, for any reason, you thought the British people would have had that right as well, but they've had that right trampled on, and they've had their home trampled on, and then they had entire generations of their kids being preyed on by predatory foreigners, right? All the while the government blamed them and blamed them and blamed them. Got to think how far back a lot of the initiatives that we were seeing, the seeds that were being sown all the way back then, and now we are the ones that have to reap the harvest. Right, or the generation before us, and particularly in the big cities in England and stuff like that, obviously, are now reaping the fruits of that. Support for controls by 1961 then had risen to 73% nationally, reflecting a continued shift towards restrictionism as migration flows increased. You're seeing how far back there again. This is not to say that I hate anybody or anything like that, or to say that, you know, Britain is absolutely perfect or wherever. It's just to show that public attitude was strongly against more and more immigration. And that attitude has not only been, the wants of the British people from that have not only been not listened to, but they've been outright demonized, and the government turned on them to continue bringing in more and more people that they did not want here. It's the whole notion, supposedly democracy is power to the people, and they can have a say in their future, they can have a say in their governance or whatever. Well, all the way back to the mid-50s, they could see that that is not true. They could see that that's not true. And you could say that they were wrong or they weren't wrong or wherever. That's a different thing than saying this is what the British people wanted and they were not given it in their own home. Supposedly democracy is the thing that allows them to have a say in their governance and a say in their future. Well, that say was taken away from them. That's the biggest thing. That's the biggest, lie of this whole Windrush and the Race Council Cymru that they're trying to push with all these quote-unquote stories, and that you called and we came. Call was never sent. The call was never sent. Yes, we would have had a lot of hardship trying to rebuild after World War II, but we could have done it. We could have done it. We didn't need anybody else. It's easy for me to say now in my lovely air-conditioned or centrally heated room speaking into a microphone and a webcam. Yes, it's easy for me to say I never went through the hardships that that generation did. But it could have been done. It could have been done. But it was the first step, seemingly, of a government in particular taking the easier route when it would have been much more fruitful in the long run, which is what I talked about in the last episode as well, where I talked about taking things that are easy, right, in the short run and make you feel better in the short run, but then you have to pay for that in the long run, right? If we'd paid for it more for longer in that time after World War II, maybe we would have had a lot less problems now. But having just had one of the most destructive wars in the entire civilization up to that point, I can understand why. I can understand why there was this want for hardship to end. I can fully understand that. That's why I'm not denigrating that generation of Brits or whatever for not seeing how this would be used in the future. They could never have seen how this would be used, how this would be propagandized, and how many lies would be spun about them, how many lies would be spun about their home, and how a lot of people that had come in would try to co-opt this home of their people, right? And many to now try and subjugate their future descendants at that time, especially having just gone through one of the most destructive wars in history. And with the only nation, I believe, to be in it from start to finish, pretty much. The only nation opposed to the Nazis that were in it from start to finish. Again, this is not a commentary on World War II itself, whether we should have got involved, whether we shouldn't have got involved, who was the bad guy, who was the good guy, was there a clear good and bad guy? Not discussion. Point is, it does seem to me at least that the easier option was taken by the government, and whether they sort of had these initiatives in mind back then, I don't know, to, alleviate labour shortfalls and stuff like that, whatever it may be. And the people sort of went along with it for a while. Very quickly, opinion changed. And then they had their rights gradually more and more trampled on, trampled on, trampled on. I don't think you can blame the people then, even though it does seem that they did see what it would bring, judging by how opinions changed, right? Judging by how many said that they would move away if their community would then not be dominated by, not be, ethnically homogenous. You can't necessarily blame them for being ignorant of how Britain would be now. But ultimately, we have to deal with what we have now. But why is it again a lie? Not only about all the George Floyd stuff, not only about the whole fentanyl stuff, not only about all that. You look at the stats, and again, stats on these things you do sometimes have to be careful of, because our government often doesn't record things for politicized reasons. They don't want people knowing the ethnicity of certain crimes committed and stuff like that because it goes against the narrative. So when we're looking at this, for example, when we're talking about, because when they say equality, what they really mean is equity. They want the system to be equitized. So meaning you have equal proportions of every single person, right? What that means is that if you have 91 black and 19 white going to prison, well, you need to send more whites to prison to make up for that, or you need to send less black people to prison. That's what ultimately is going to mean if you go with this equity system, which is what equality is used as a cover for. What does that mean? It means that you not send lots of violent criminals to prison for racial reasons, for racially politicized reasons, and then you end up with Irina Zarutska. Then you end up with that young girl, not young girl, then you end up with that woman that recently got torched on the Chicago subway. The guy had 72 prior arrests. And again, the whole George Floyd thing, how it plays into the whole racism narrative, which is completely fake. Right? At least the way that they portray. Look at the numbers. Look at the numbers that we do have. Especially, this is where it comes down to a notion of per capita. Per capita often strikes the heart of a lot of these arguments, and is often a thing that lefties really don't want to talk about, because it really goes against their narrative, right? But when we're having a look, so there are certain documents, for example, that talk about this. One of them, for example, looking at the government's reports of arrests. This was published 3rd of July, 2024. And when we're looking at arrests by ethnicity, this is what you will see, at least in this document anyway. This is from April 2022 to March 2023. This is the most up-to-date, really, that I can find. And I'll bring it up on screen for you in a moment. Let me just... there we are. There we are. Okay, let me just recenter this. But it shows you the arrest rate per different demographics. I'm not exactly sure if this is broken down by specific crime, but we've got more stuff to go over with regards to that, so just bear with me. But you see graphs that look like this. And you can definitely see there's a lot of overrepresentation of certain individuals. Namely, for example, if I tab over to it a moment, the black populations, in one instance here, whatever this one is vastly overrepresented versus white, several fold, about 5 or so times, I believe it is. You have so much double. Black Caribbeans are about double what the whites are, 1.5. For black Africans, black in general, about double. So, are we not going to send these people to prison if they're potentially violent criminals and stuff like that? Or are we not? Is that what we're not going to do? But then you break it down by per 1,000, for example. Well, that's arrest rates per 1,000. And again, if I bring this up for you as well, you can see it here. And this really shows as well, when a lot of these activists will try to say, oh, look how many white people got arrested. Yes. But they deliberately fail to mention and exclude to mention that Britain, at least at this present moment in time, is still a majority white nation. Because the native populace, right? The native population is white population. But this is what the table will look like in terms of number of arrests versus arrest rate per 1,000. And this is the whole per capita thing, basically. So you have here number of arrests, 15,000, or is it 16,000? 15,000 for black other, 14,000 for black Caribbean, right? Now you go all the way down because there was a total of 668,979, right? The arrest rate for white individuals here right, across this time frame, 9.4, but a massively increased total, right? Massively increased number of arrests. So it's going to show here that we have significant problems with certain elements of the population. We have certain parts of the population that, for various reasons, seem to be committing more crimes. Because this is the thing. Police are often scared. As far as I'm aware, anyway. Police will be often scared to try and arrest black individuals because they saw what happened to George Floyd. Something was to happen, they'll have riots and all of these things because of how much this anti-racism framework is ingrained in. The whole thing, that's why Irina Zarutska's killer was let out. That's why the guy was let out after 72 arrests, right? Because they're often scared of being called racist. You see things like that with gangs, right? Yet you still have massive overrepresentation of certain people in these groups. You still have massive representations of certain people. This one is from a document titled Homicide in England and Wales. In fact, I'll bring this one up as well. I'll quickly bring this this document up as well. Here we go. So this is what I wanted to bring up now. And I talked about before Grok's breakdown of certain demographics obviously being more represented for things like homicide, theft, all of these things. When we're looking at age, sex, and ethnicity of convicted suspects, for example, obviously you have a lot more convicted males than females, right? As we would expect. But in this little footnote in the bottom of this document here, which I will bring up on screen for you in just a moment, it really highlights the kind of problem that we're dealing with. And it's a reality that a lot of these activists, particularly the anti-racism activists and all of these people, don't want to confront. They don't want to go anywhere near this stuff, right? So have a look at this graph now, for example. And again, this document will be linked down below as well. Age, sex, and ethnicity of convicted suspects. For a 3-year period, year ending March 2022 to year ending March 2024, most suspects of convicted of homicide were male, about 92%. And that's what this graph here is conveying, right? Mostly in the age range of 16 to 24. I argue you have more females than males being convicted from about 35 to 44 and 45 to 54. See, it's weird, right? The younger you are, right? The younger people, more likely for males to be the majority of homicide convictions, and then as you get older, it then tends to be dominated by females. That's quite interesting. Wonder it's because of how many unhappy relationships or whatever. But then look at this at the bottom. For the 3-year period ending, again, March 22 to 24, looking at the principal suspect of a homicide offence, 2/3 of those convicted were identified as white. This was a lower representation than in the general population based on the 2021 census figures. Around 1 in 5 suspects were identified as black, 5 times higher than the representation in the general population. Around 1 in 10 were identified as Asian. So in order to reach kind of equality or whatever, you have to think of how many cases more would have to be ignored on racial grounds. We've already seen how many young British girls have been damaged and many instances murdered because of how many cases have been ignored because of racial reasons. But yet our Welsh government wants to go full steam ahead with this in pursuit of making Wales quote-unquote anti-racist. Well, if that's what making Wales anti-racist means, well then consider me in staunch opposition to whatever quote-unquote anti-racist Wales would be. Because you see here, it's discrimination against the Welsh people. That's what it is. It will be active discrimination against the Welsh people for political reasons. That's what it will be. And then you have a look at this one, for example. So this is Statistics on Ethnicity and the Criminal Justice System, 2022. You get down to offender characteristics in Section 7. In 2022, 77% of all males prosecuted for indictable offences were from the white ethnic group. The proportion of defendants from the black ethnic group was 11% of all male prosecutions compared to 6% of all female prosecutions. Given the fact that, again, they make up about 4% around this time of the general population, that's an overrepresentation of 1.5 to nearly 3 times, depending on if it's a man or a woman. Right? And the really sad thing is as well, and this is why I think, again, it's a massive cultural problem, is because you only need as well, and this is the sad thing when we're looking at, particularly in the youth in this country and stuff like that, the percentage of homicide victims. And this is the thing where, again, they want to go systemic discrimination and stuff like that. Well, you need to address also that not only are they vastly overrepresented for the proportion of the population in things like homicide, 1 in 5, you also then need to address, right? Where is it? It's this graph here, which I'll just try and make sure it's centered on screen for you, that over a third of homicide victims, right? Or, yeah, over a third, nearly 40% of homicide victims are black people from the ages of 16 to 24. Very young. And what is prominent at this point in time, ladies and gentlemen, usually gang culture. Gang culture, where it seems there's a good amount of these people that are going around killing each other. And then you think of other things, drugs. You think of, I don't know, someone said something to the other one's, or someone slept with someone's girlfriend or whatever, or there was another crime that occurred and it was a revenge thing. Who knows, right? But you have not only vast overrepresentation in people committing crimes, homicides, then you have vast amounts of overrepresentation in the victims, particularly young victims. I don't see how that's the fault of somebody that looks like me. Maybe I'm uneducated. Maybe I'm not able to see it or wherever, you know? Or maybe I do see it. I just, don't go along with what the activists and all those people want me to say, right? But that's a cultural problem. That's obviously a cultural problem. And I'm not one of these people at this moment in time that will go ahead and say, oh yeah, it's just all about their race. It's just because they're this color. Because you do have people that don't engage in these activities, right? You have black people that don't engage in these activities and are perfectly good people, right? Not me making the case then that they ever should have been allowed to come to Britain or anything like that. That's a separate argument. That's a separate argument. But there's a lot of good people who have different skin color to people that look like me, right? So it's quite clearly something else. There's something wrong in this culture. Whether it's fatherlessness, whether it's deadbeat dads, right? Whether it's other things that are coming in, right? Other factors, you name them off. But you've got serious problems in this demographic in particular, and quote-unquote racial justice in the way that these people want to bring it in, not going to fix it. Not going to fix it. It's going to make it worse. It's going to make it worse in an already strained, already on the breaking point country. And people, politicians especially want to be careful now playing games like this. Because people, make no mistake, have had enough. People have had enough. If you enjoyed that clip, then make sure to go on over to the Voice of the Valleys X page at VOT_Valleys on X. We're also on Instagram at Voice of the Valleys. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment, all of that good stuff. Thank you so much, and we'll see you again soon. Godspeed.